there. So today we're going to discuss temporary leases. And the reason I have this set up is because I'm a visual learner and I know that a lot of people are, so it's a little bit easier to understand and see what a seller or a buyer temporary lease means. So we're going to start with the seller temporary lease, okay? So I'm going to put seller here. Now, let's say our original closing date is scheduled for the very end of the month, okay? So the seller will be paying prorated interest to their lender all these days, correct? So all the way through here. The title company will get the payoff. So when they give their mortgage payment the following month on the 1st, if they did, that actually counts for interest here, the month prior. So if they close on the 31st, they'll owe 31 days of prorated interest. Now, let's say the buyer has to move in sooner because, or close sooner because their rate is going to expire, or they want to change jobs, but they can't because, change in jobs will create a big issue with their loan. And let's say that they actually want to close here on the 15th, but they say to Mr. and Mrs. Seller, that can we please close on the 15th, but you guys can stay until the 31st, right? But at this point, if they do close early, then the seller will be paying prorated interest all the way to this date only. As of this day, the property now becomes the buyer's in title, and that's when the prorated interest starts for the buyer. The buyer is now paying for the house here. Taxes, insurance, principal, interest, right? So now the buyer is incurring this expense. Now, because the buyer is now incurring this expense, but the seller is still staying there, then the seller becomes a tenant. The seller no longer owns the house. The seller's no longer paying interest. So what happens in that instance? Well, because this belongs to the buyer and the previous seller becomes a tenant, then they will owe prorated daily rent, okay? So usually we take, let's say, we take whatever the mortgage is a month for the buyer, we divide it by 30 and we figure out what the daily rent becomes. So this is the seller temporary lease, okay? Now, when the seller says, I'm not going to pay for, to stay in my own home, well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, technically you're not. As of this date, the buyer now owns the property. The buyer's paying prorated, everything, and you're staying until, the move out date that you have originally agreed to. It's a convenient way to kind of resolve an issue for everybody involved. The seller has already made plans for the movers for that date, can't change it. But you know what, the buyer wants to close sooner so that they don't have, avoid whatever issues. And then that way the seller just pays a prorated rent. The seller, even if we were to close on this date, the seller's still paying. If we keep the original date, the seller would still be paying. They're just paying it to their lender instead of the new owner. So either way, easy way to resolve an issue. That's the seller's temporary lease. So let's jump to the buyer temporary lease, okay? So let's say the same thing. Closing is supposed to happen on this date, right? But the buyer wants to move in early because they've got to vacate their property or whatever, right? Let's say the buyer moves in here, they ask to move in here. Now, if we keep the closing date, the seller is still paying prorated interest, right? Taxes, insurance, all that good stuff, all the way up to this point. Because the seller continues to pay and is not habitating the property and the buyer moves in, then the buyer has to pay rent, because technically the house does not belong to the buyer until closing and funding. So because the buyer moves in, they pay rent. So whoever stays in the property during that change of keys is the person who's going to pay rent. So in this case, if the buyer moves in, then the buyer pays rent. So whether the buyer waits until closing or the seller does, somebody's got to pay for the time that they're in the property. If they close if they don't close until the very end of the month, but the buyer's living there, then the buyer would pay the seller prorated rent. And I've had instances where the buyer says, I'm not going to pay for rent on my own house. Well, technically, the house doesn't belong to you until the very end of the month. But again, this is a different alternative. We switch the situation around and it resolves an issue for all parties. So I hope that helps. Thanks. Bye-bye. Little reminder that my business is based on referrals. Without wonderful people such as yourself, I could not keep my business running. So if you happen to know of anybody, friend, family, coworker, neighbor that is interested in buying, selling, or investing in real estate, I would love to give them the best level of personal care. Thanks so much. Feel free to reach out, text, email, or call me. Thanks. Bye-bye.